It kind of feels a bit like coming home, although I'm not coming home. My wife comes from Merthyr, so not too far away. We've got. Actually, she doesn't tell many people she comes from Merthyr. I don't know why, but there you go. And I've got lots of old friends from Clandrinda Wells and John Morgan here. I haven't seen for I don't know how many years, at least 30. Yeah. So it's really, really good to be home. And let me let you into a secret. Everybody thinks wherever I go in the world, actually, that with a name like Mervyn Thomas, I must be from Wales. Well, I'll tell you a secret. Because my dad always told, I was actually born in Essex. But my dad always told me that his dad had told him that his dad had come from Treorchy. So I always thought that I'd got this Welsh. I've always supported Wales, incidentally. I was one of those that shouted for Wales just now. Long after my dad had died, I was with my dad's sister. And my old aunt, she was very old, and I said to her something about, well, you know, your granddad came from Treorchy. No, he didn't, she said. He came from Pontypool. So I said, well, okay, well, who told you that? My dad. So I said, well, your dad told my dad that he came from Treorchy. So I said, it doesn't matter, you know, it's all Wales, isn't it? So she said, well, I'm going to find out. And so they found out. We went right back to 1700, and all of our ancestors came from Chatham in Kent. But there you go. So it's good to be home today. And thank you for inviting me. And I just want to read some verses from the Word of God from Hebrews chapter 11. Let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. Hebrews chapter 11. I'm reading from verses 32 to the end, just a few verses. And it says, how much more, and remember, Hebrews chapter 11 is that chapter in the Bible of the heroes of the faith. It goes through people in the Old Testament, men and women of faith. But this, at the end of it, it says, how much more do I need to say? And it'll take me too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death. But then it kind of changes. It says, but others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half and others were killed with the sword. It's pretty horrific, isn't it? Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. So that's reading those verses, you can see that persecution of men and women of faith has been around forever, right since the beginning of time. People were persecuted for their faith, and you know, we all know the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of Daniel in the lion's den. You know, these triumphant stories actually, but these verses actually then talk about other people. They talk about people that were, it says, sawn in half. That means beheaded. People who were beheaded for their faith. People who were tortured. And that's pretty horrific. But it doesn't mean, I just want to say this morning, it doesn't mean to say that Daniel, for example, who was saved from the mouth of the lions, had any more faith than the person that was sawn in two. Because the word here says that all of them were commended for their faith. Now, I don't know why some had to be tortured. I don't know why some were miraculously delivered, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we just have to trust God that He knows what He's doing. Some go through these things and some don't. And it's the same today. Persecution has been with us from the beginning. You know, and you go back to the early church. The early church, you know, I often quite amused actually when I go to churches, and sometimes people say to me, you know, we model ourselves on the early church. And I think, well, the pastor says that to me. I think, well, if that's true, you wouldn't be here, mate, because you'd be martyred. And because nearly all of the early church, all of Jesus' disciples actually, apart from Judas and John, were martyred for their faith. It was part of the job. Sorry, Rob, but it was part of the job. And the church was born into persecution. And Jesus said, you know, if they hate me, they'll hate you because of me. And in fact, Paul says to Timothy, if you want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted. That's not a promise you find in one of those old promise boxes, is it? But if you want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted. Now, we're fortunate in this country because we are not persecuted. You know, and I often get that question when I go to churches too. What about persecution in Britain? There isn't any persecution in Britain, okay? There is more and more discrimination. There is absolutely no doubt about that. That we could be on the path to persecution, but we are not persecuted yet. We are free. We are free to come here on a Sunday. We're free to go out into the streets and preach the gospel. And persecution is actually something that happens. There's a legal definition for persecution. We won't go into that this morning, but we don't suffer that. But we need to be aware that it could come. I'm not come to talk to you about that this morning, but we need to be aware that it could come in this country. So persecution has been around since in the Old Testament times, the New Testament times. Today, do you know something like 80, according to the Pew Foundation, which does statistics on religious freedom, 84% of the world's population, 84% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. That's staggering, isn't it? We're not in those statistics, okay? We're in the other 16%. But 84% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions. Now, that's not just Christian persecution, because actually people of other faiths are persecuted too. And let me just say something. Let me just tell you what CSW does quickly. I'm not really here to talk about CSW, but I want to talk about it. Because CSW, we feel that we are called to be a voice for voiceless people around the world. Proverbs 31 says that we're to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. Okay? Hebrews 13 verse 3 says, remember those in prison as if you were in prison with them. 1 Corinthians 12 verse 26 says that we're part of the body of Christ, and when one part suffers, all parts suffer. We have to ask ourselves the question sometimes, do we really suffer with those that are suffering around the world? That's a question we can ask ourselves. But we in CSW, the key thing is we feel we're an advocacy organisation. So we don't get involved in aid, we don't get involved in training pastors and those kind of wonderful projects. But what we do is we go to countries, we work in around 30 countries where we go and we find out what's happening, we write reports, pretty boring it may sound, but really important reports that go to governments around the world. So that governments can actually make a difference, so that in time, and it does take a long time, but in time we can see that 84% come down. More Christians were persecuted in the 20th century than all the other centuries put together. That's incredible, isn't it? And it continues. And actually, I just want to pause a second, because that sounds awful. But there is a positive side to that. Do you know why more Christians are persecuted in the 20th century than all the others put together? I can tell you why, because the church is bigger than it's ever been. Okay? Don't let anybody tell you. And I was in Malaysia not that long ago, and pastors were coming to me saying, oh, we're so sorry to hear about the church in the UK. I said, what about the church in the UK? Well, that all the churches are closing and turning into mosques. I said, I don't know where you got that from. I said, but, well, Islam's taking over. I said, well, no, it's not. That's not true. You may have, and then seen pictures on the internet of old churches that have been turned into mosques. Yes, that happens. I said, but you want to see the schools and the theatres and the places that are filled with Christians every Sunday morning. They might not be meeting in those old chapels because they're too small now. But the church, Jesus Christ said, I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. The church is growing. And I mentioned, Rob, you mentioned someone. Who's here from Nepal this morning? Nepal? Anybody?
I'm not from Nepal, but I live there.
Okay. Nepal is a point in question about the church growing. I want to tell you because I know statistics on this. It's incredible. In 1960, there were only 50 Christians in Nepal. This is a Hindu country. In 1960, there were 50 Christians, and all of them were from outside of Nepal. They were from India, they were from Britain. They were doctors and nurses and teachers who'd gone in there to follow their profession, but to preach the gospel. By 1990, that 50 had grown to 50,000. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and I was talking to a very old friend of mine who was imprisoned in Nepal in the 80s, and I said to him, Charles, how big is the church in Nepal today? He said, it's probably 10% of the population. The population is 30 million. So there could be 3 million Christians today from those 50 that were there in 1960. The Church of Jesus Christ is growing. I actually gave those statistics of the church I was speaking at a couple of years ago, and afterwards a little old lady, very old lady, came up to me afterwards and she said, I just want you to know I was one of the 50. I was a nurse that went in there. What a legacy. We never know, do we? When we plant the seed, we never know what will grow. So the Church of Jesus Christ is growing. But as I say, so we speak out in government, we speak out in the UK. I sit on the Foreign Secretary's Human Rights Advisory Group just to speak about religious freedom and persecution of people of faith. And it's really, when we started, and I started CSW in 1979, and when we started, it was in response to Christian persecution in Eastern Europe, in the old Soviet bloc, before communism fell. And it was the only persecution that we really knew about in the church. If you're of an age like me, you'll remember that we heard about Christian persecution in Russia, didn't we? And in Romania, in those places. And so that was all we heard about. Well, 10 years after that, in 1989, communism fell throughout Eastern Europe. It suddenly changed overnight, and we had to look around to see, well, where is there any more persecution? We don't know if there's any more persecution. As we looked around, we saw, there were so many places in the world where Christians were persecuted. And then one day, one of my staff came to me and he said, do you know, he'd just come back from Burma or Myanmar, and we were speaking about the Christian groups in that country, the Chin and the Kachin, the Karen and the Karenni groups, ethnic groups who were Christians. And he said, but I've just come across a group called Rohingya Muslims, he said, and they are just as badly persecuted as the Christians. What do? We're Christians, we can't speak out for those people. Ooh, well, that made me, I'll tell you, I then made a decision that I've kind of been ashamed of for a long while. I said, well, yeah, we do need to speak up for those. We definitely need to speak up for those people. But I don't think we can tell our supporters that, because they're all evangelical Christians and there's no way I'm going to lose all my money. And to my shame, for about 10 years, whenever we were facing Parliament or Capitol Hill or United Nations, we talked about people like the Rohingya, but I didn't tell it when I came and spoke to people like you guys. And one day I thought, I can't, this is wrong. What does the Bible say about it? So we brought in a theologian to come and take us through what the Bible said at CSW, and with all of our staff, and it's wow. You go, right, mate, I won't go through all that. I could speak actually for the next hour on this, but there's lots of stuff in the Old Testament about looking after the foreigner and the alien. And when Jesus, of course, was asked by the man that came to him and said, who's my neighbour? Jesus told that story of the Good Samaritan, what we call the Good Samaritan. Basically, what Jesus was saying to this man who was hoping that the man was hoping that Jesus would tell him a few names of his neighbours that he could tick off, because the Pharisees loved ticking off things they were doing, didn't they? That they got right. And but Jesus basically said, well, everybody is your neighbour, but I'll give you an example. And the example he gave was of people that the Jews hated. They didn't get on with. They didn't see eye to eye. They were enemies. Jesus says, here's your neighbour. And so, and that verse that I talked about in Proverbs, speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. It doesn't say speak up for Christians. It doesn't say speak up for God's covenant people. It says speak up for those unable to speak for themselves, whoever they are. That's our duty as Christians. And so we, and you know, if two people came in this church this morning, if suddenly those doors opened and a Muslim and a Christian came in, or a Hindu and a Christian, and they were both hungry, would you only feed the Christian? Pardon? No. Well, that's a relief. Of course we wouldn't. Of course we wouldn't. We are called, and you know, when we speak up for the Rohingya Muslims, and we, you know, have you heard of the Uyghur Muslims in China? 3 million of them in re-education camps. How can we turn a blind eye to that as Christians? That is wrong. Of course listen, I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father, all right? Get that out of the way. I'm not a separatist. I don't believe that all faiths lead to the same God. Of course not. I believe that Jesus Christ is the way. But as Christians, we are called to be compassionate. God is a God of justice. And God also made us all in his image. And he also gave us all a free will. If somebody chooses to be a Muslim or a Hindu or an atheist, because atheists also are persecuted, you know, in some countries. Atheists are beheaded in Bangladesh. God gave us a free will, and whilst I 100% can't agree with their theology, and I want people to turn to Christ. I want religious freedom around the world so that we are free to preach the gospel. Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which is the thing that we work with when we're working with governments and the United Nations. Article 18 gives everybody the right to choose their religion, to change their religion, and to practice their religion. And all three of those are key, actually. When it comes to Muslims, we have to be very, very careful, because one thing that they don't like is change religion. Because if you change away from Islam, you become an apostate, and you can be killed for that in many places. But the key thing is practice your religion. We're not talking about, often people talk about freedom of worship. We're not talking about freedom of worship. Freedom of worship means we can come in these four walls here, we can do what we've done this morning, we can sing songs, we can pray, we can do all of those things in private, but we can't go out there and propagate it. We can't go out there and make a difference in the community. That's not what freedom of worship is. Freedom of worship is just in four walls. So let's remember, what we really want to see is people free to be able to practice their faith, and people free to be able to change their faith. Sorry if I'm getting a bit technical, but you know, it's important to know about these things when there's so many people in the world that are persecuted. And I want to tell you this too, that when we go, one of my staff went to visit an atheist in prison in Indonesia. Okay, he was in prison because he was an atheist, and my staff member went to see him, and he gave him his card. They gave him his card in the prison, and the man said, he looked at his card and he said, I think you've probably made a mistake. This is the prisoner, the atheist prisoner. He said, I think you've probably made a mistake. So he said, well, why did you say that? He said, well, didn't they tell you I'm an atheist, and I see that you're from Christian Solidarity Worldwide? He said, well, yeah, I did. Of course I knew you were an atheist. So he said, well, why have you come to see me? He said, because I'm a Christian. Because I'm a Christian. Because I don't believe you should be in here. Because God is a God of justice and hates injustice. Is that missional or not when you do that? It's missional when we speak up for people. It's what we should do. And you know, the Word of God tells us it doesn't only say that we should love our enemies, it says that we should bless our enemies. Wow, that's not so easy, is it? And I tell you who are brilliant at this, Christians in Egypt are absolutely brilliant at this. When their people are martyred, they forgive them, they bless them, they're amazing at this. So, I never really know where to start. I want to tell you some stories and a few things about where things are happening in the world today, so that we can know about them, so we can pray about them. Statistic of 84% doesn't tell you about a person called Leah Sharibu, for example, in Nigeria, does it? Leah Sharibu was 14 years old, nearly 5 years ago. This month, 5 years ago, she was taken. She was a Christian school child, 14 years of age. She was taken by a terrorist group, Boko Haram. And they took her together with 110 other girls, 109 other girls. And they took them and they kidnapped them from their school. And they took them away into the forest. And then the government of Nigeria negotiated their release. But as all the girls were getting back on their transport to go back to their where they came from, they suddenly realised, the terrorists realised, that there was one girl who was not a Muslim. The others were all Muslims. This girl was a Christian, Leah Sharibu, 14 years old. They said to her, "You can go home with the others, but first of all, you need to convert to Islam." Put yourself in her position. Even at our age, let alone at 14, would you have wanted to go home with the other 109 girls? Would you have had any, of course you wouldn't have had any desire to stay in the forest with these terrorists? All you've got to do is say these words. You might not even have to mean them. Just say, the 14-year-old Leah said, "No, I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a Christian." Because of that, Leah today is still in that terrorist camp. She's going to be 19 actually, on May the 14th this year. I know it's May the 14th because it's my birthday too, and I always remember Leah. But she's just one. She's part of that 84%. But she's just one of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians who have individual stories. There's a girl in Nigeria too called Deborah Emmanuel. Not quite a year ago, last May, she was in college and she was older than Leah, maybe 19. She was in college studying domestic science, and she was on a WhatsApp group with the other students in her class. Many of them were Muslims, but she found that a lot of the WhatsApp chat was talking about faith things, was talking about Islamic things, and she didn't like that. She said, all she said was on there, "Can we just restrict this chat to talking about our academic work, our domestic science, whatever it is we're doing, rather than to talk about religion?" Do you know what happened? Hundreds of students came, they took her, they lynched her, they burnt her alive. Sorry to have to say things like that to you this morning, but you know, we need to know this. Deborah Emmanuel, that's her name. It's happening today in Nigeria, many other places. I went to Iraq a few years ago, and I met a lot of people, but I met one girl that stays with me now. She was a Christian, and when ISIS, and I was actually in Mosul the week after it had been liberated from ISIS, although they were still there. But I met this girl that had been taken when ISIS had come 3 years before. She'd been taken, and she told me her story. She'd been trafficked 22 times. She'd been owned by 22 different men, both in Iraq and in Syria. Owned by, raped by. At one point, she was tied to a lamppost or a post in one city where she was, and with a sign on "for sale."
where men would go by and lift her clothing to check what they were buying. Can you imagine 22 times? What is, she eventually escaped. She was a Christian, she came back, she was an Orthodox Christian, a Syrian Orthodox Christian. The worst part of this stuff, if that's not horrendous, what I've told you, the worst part was she came back to her village and her Christian friends disowned her because she brought dishonour to the faith. That's horrific, isn't it? It's very cultural. The night she told me that story during the day, I went to an evangelical church in the town that night, and I told them that story. And I said, because this girl is frightened. She's living, she won't go out because she thinks the Christians are going to kill her, and she thinks the Muslims are going to kill her. And they said, bring her to us and we'll look after her. But her name was Marianne. Marianne is just one of so many. There are still 3,000 Yazidi girls. They're not Christians, Yazidis from Sinjar. And we went to Sinjar too. And 3,000 girls are still missing, trafficked. As Christians, do we just shrug our shoulders? What's our response? I'll come to that in a minute. I just want to tell you, do you know the worst country in the world for societal violence against religious minorities? The worst country in the world, I'll tell you, because you won't know, it's India. One of the big economic superpowers. Has the worst record for, that means people attacking Christians and Muslims in India. And almost every day we have reports of attacks, of people being killed, pastors being killed. We had a case last year, a man called a 27-year-old pastor of a church. They'd come and they'd taken him, he was living in a Hindu village, and they'd taken him and they'd come and they'd killed him and just left his body outside the house. His wife and 2 little children, both under the age of 3, were in the house when it happened. And the local friends and family from the other villages took his wife and 2 little children, and they said, the only way that you can continue living is by turning back to Hinduism. And she said these words, she said, I'll live for Jesus and I'll die for Jesus, but I'll never turn back. You sing that chorus, don't we? We used to sing that chorus. No turning back, no turning back. And kind of it trips off the tongue, doesn't it? But would we say it in those situations? I don't know. I don't know what I would say. I hope I know what I would say. But you know, we can't condemn those that do. When I was in Iraq, I met a young boy. He was 13 when he was taken by ISIS. 13 years old, and he was made to go. He was with a number of other Christians taken, and they said, you either become a Muslim and fight with us, or you die. And he saw his other Christian friends, men, most of them men. He was just a boy, 13 years old, or he may have been 12. And he saw his others from the church shot dead. When it came to him, he said, yeah, I'll become a Muslim. I met him when he was then 15. He showed me his ISIS uniform. And he said, I never meant it in my heart. But when I've come back, I've been completely cut off by all my Christian friends. You know, we can't condemn those people. Because we don't know how we would react in that. Jesus knows. And he's a follower of Jesus, but he did something that he regretted afterwards. But he felt as a 12 or 13-year-old boy that he didn't have any choice. You know, it's almost impossible for us to put ourselves in that position, isn't it? But these are real stories. These are real people. This is happening time after time. I've got a friend called Helen Bahami, and she was a gospel singer in Eritrea, and because she refused to stop preaching the gospel. She used to go out in the open air on the streets of Asmara in Eritrea and preach the gospel. And she released an album because she was a worship leader in a Pentecostal church in Eritrea. Because of that, she was put in a metal shipping container for 3.5 years. That was the prison, metal shipping container with 30 other ladies. And now if you can imagine being in a metal shipping container with no windows, in one of the hottest countries on this planet, so during the day it was like an oven, at night it was like being in a freezer. Because she was a Christian and because she refused to stop preaching the gospel to all the women around her, they chained her to a mad woman. And she said she never slept for nights and nights and nights because she was worried that this woman used to constantly attack her. The guards beat her to within an inch of her death. Before she did, they let her go actually, because organisations like CSW were campaigning for Helen. And they eventually let her go because they didn't want her to die in prison. She escaped, and the long story is she's now living in the West, and she's spending her life telling others about, not her story. She's not interested in her story, she's interested in saving others that are there today. She's got an amazing testimony. But these are real people. The reason I'm telling these stories is so you can identify with them. They're just like any one of us sitting here today. So what can our response be to this? We do have to respond. I'm sorry, it's hard. If you come here and hear these stories this morning and weep, that's good. But it's not enough. It's not enough. Weeping must lead to action. Action. What can we do? Well, I'm going to tell you 4 P's. We can pray. It's the most important thing. I don't know, Rob, whether you've got any links with CSW here, but we would love to have somebody in this church, like an ambassador for CSW, where we send out a weekly prayer email, where you can bring that, and it goes out on a Saturday, deliberately on a Saturday, so people can bring some of those requests to church on a Sunday. Maybe take them to your home. But you can pray. Prayer changes things. Who believes prayer changes things? Yes, good. Okay, it's quite a few. I hope there's a few more that put their hands up. But anyway, prayer does change things. It really does. So we can pray, we can protest. And we can protest by writing to our members of parliament. And we send out lots of stuff. Go onto our website, csw.org.uk. Lots of things where you can write to your MPs. These things do make a difference, actually. They really do make a difference. I work in parliament probably 2 or 3 days a week. And MPs after MP will tell me that people write to them about these situations and they will take it up. Ministers will take it up. So it's really important we do that. I've actually got a petition at the back there, outside in the lobby on the table. I've got a petition for a Cuban pastor, Cuban Pentecostal pastor, who demonstrated, or didn't demonstrate, he went out on the streets praying, had some demonstrations, anti-communist or anti-everything demonstrations in Cuba a few years ago, just a year before last, 2021. And he was just praying on the streets. That's all he was doing. He wasn't involved in any violent protest, but they picked him up because they knew he was a pastor of a very much growing church. They picked him up, and he's now been in prison for 7.5 years, just for going on the streets and praying. His name's Pastor Lorenzo. I've got a petition out there. Please, it's to the ambassador, the Cuban ambassador in London. Please do sign it. It might take you a few extra minutes to sign just before you go, but it can make a difference. We need to do something. Pray, protest, provide. You can provide, and I've certainly not come here to ask for money this morning, but you can provide for organisations like CSW, people who work in this field, because we work on 30 countries, I told you. We could work on 60 countries if we had the resources to do that. You can provide in other ways. So we've got something called Connect and Encourage. It's an address book. And you can write letters and cards of encouragement to people in prison or to human rights defenders in different countries. And it makes a difference when I've been to countries where somebody once brought me out a shoebox full of letters that had been praying for her husband who'd been in prison. or had been disappeared actually. And she said to me, these have all come from your country, she's from Christians. She said, and every day I take one of those cards and I pray for the person that sent it. Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? But we can provide in that way. The fourth thing we can do is proclaim. We can tell other people about this. You know, people need to know some of these things I've been telling you about, because you won't read it in the media. We send out press release after press release after press release, probably 7 or 8 press releases, probably one a day at least, about these situations. Do you remember a few years ago the Charlie Hebdo, the bombing in Charlie Hebdo in Paris, where a dozen journalists were killed? You know, that was on our newspapers every single day for several weeks. On the front page of the news. In the same week, 200 Christians were slaughtered in northern Nigeria, and we sent out press releases, but nobody picked it up at all. You won't hear about it. So we need to tell other people. But the most important thing is that we do not remain silent. I'm going to finish by just reading you a short paragraph from a book written by a man called Pastor Erwin Lutzer. Pastor Erwin Lutzer was a very old man when he wrote this, living in America, but as a young boy he lived in Nazi Germany as a Christian. And this is what he said. A railroad track ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning we could hear the whistle in the distance, and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by. We realised that it was carrying Jews like cattle in the cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew we'd hear the cries of the Jews en route to death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the train was coming, and when we heard the whistle blow. So when we heard the whistle blow, we began singing hymns. By the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the tops of our voices. If we heard the screams, we simply sang more loudly, and soon we heard them no more. Although years have passed, I still hear the train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me. God forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians and yet did nothing to intervene. Friends, brothers and sisters, when we know what's going on in the world, when we hear these stories and we do nothing, I'm sorry, but we're complicit in what's happening. No action is action. And we need to just remember that. I don't want this to be heavy this morning, but I do want us to recognise that the world is hurting. And we as Christians have got the answer. But we don't provide the answer by remaining silent. So please be prepared to stand up and speak out for these people, whether they're Christians, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Hindus, whether they're Buddhists, whoever they may be. If they're suffering, Jesus wants us to speak out for them and say, we're here for